It's pretty wild, right? To hear about a country going from like super dangerous to one of the safest in the world. I mean, El Salvador used to be all over the news for gang violence, and now they're boasting some of the lowest homicide rates. And the thing that's fueling this turnaround is this massive prison. I mean, we're talking 40,000 inmates, many from those infamous games like MS-13.
Right.
So in this deep dive, we're going beyond just like the headlines, you know? We're going to take a closer look at this controversial approach to fighting crime. Like, what does this prison tell us about gangs, about security on a massive scale? And also, like, what about the human cost, the human rights? It's a tricky balance, right?
It's a very complex issue. And to really understand the significance of this prison, we kind of have to go back in time, back to the El Salvador before it was built. It's hard to imagine now, but this was a nation that was basically held hostage by gang violence. Groups like MS-13 and Barrio 18, they had estimated 70,000 members.
70,000.
Yeah. And in a country with a relatively small population, that's a huge number. So you can imagine the impact that had on daily life. For ordinary citizens, it was like a constant state of fear. Extortion was like an everyday occurrence. Communities were just paralyzed by fear, and the homicide rate was one of the highest globally. So you can only imagine the psychological toll that takes on an entire nation. The constant anxiety, the erosion of trust, just this pervasive feeling of being trapped.
It sounds almost like a pressure cooker, ready to explode.
Yeah.
So what changed? When did this shift towards like these mega prisons start?
Well, the turning point really came with the election of President Nayib Bukele. He came in with this very aggressive approach to crime, calling it mano dura, which translates to iron fist.
Iron Fist, that sounds intense. What did that actually look like in practice?
So it wasn't just about like increased policing. It was a fundamental change in how the state was dealing with the gang problem.
Right.
Like Bukele came in and launched this wave of arrests across the nation. I mean, we're talking over 70,000 people detained, suspected gang members. That's like 2% of the entire adult population.
2%.
Yeah. So it wasn't just targeted arrests. It was this massive dragnet. They were trying to disrupt gang operations on a massive scale.
Okay, but arresting 2% of the adult population, I mean, that's got to have some pretty big impacts on society. Were there any safeguards in place, like to prevent wrongful arrests?
Well, that's a question that a lot of human rights groups have been raising. There are reports of these nighttime raids, people being arrested without much evidence, sometimes just based on their appearance or where they lived.
Wow.
So yeah, there are concerns that maybe due process was sacrificed a little bit in this pursuit of quick results.
So you have these mass arrests, and then they're all sent to this like purpose-built prison. So tell me about this prison. What was it like? Was it built with like rehabilitation in mind, or was it just purely about containment?
Well, the design itself tells you a lot about its purpose. Imagine like this 410-acre complex surrounded by these massive 30-foot walls topped with electric fencing, like 15,000 volts. Then you've got 19 watchtowers just constantly watching. And inside the compound, each section is like designed to keep rival gangs totally separated. Minimal interaction.
It sounds less like a prison and more like some kind of fortress. What kind of message does that send? I mean, to the inmates and to the world?
Yeah, it's a pretty clear message. This is a place of absolute control. Escape is basically impossible. It's a statement, Like the state is serious about eradicating gang violence, and it's definitely meant to intimidate.
Okay, so you've got these physical barriers, but what about communication? Like with the outside world, can these inmates talk to their families? Lawyers.
That's where the tech gets really interesting. They have these super high-tech signal jammers. They basically create a communication blackout, like within a 2-kilometer radius of the prison.
Wow.
No cell phones, no radios, no internet access. Not even for journalists. I mean, they are allowed inside, but they have to, surrender all their electronics.
Yeah, a complete communication blackout. That's a level of isolation you don't see very often. What's the reasoning behind that?
Well, the government argues that this is essential.
Right.
To prevent gangs from coordinating activities from inside. They say, look, these are sophisticated criminal networks.
Yeah.
Even one phone call could have big consequences outside.
Okay, I get that from a security standpoint. But what about the inmates? Like, how does this affect their mental health? To be completely cut off from the outside world, from their loved ones.
Well, we know that solitary confinement, even for short periods, can be really damaging to mental health. So now imagine that, but amplified, extended indefinitely. No human contact, no way to seek comfort from their loved ones. The psychological toll must be immense.
And what about the families? No phone calls. No visits. How do they deal with that separation? The uncertainty about what's happening to their loved ones inside?
Yeah, it's a heartbreaking situation that often gets overlooked. Just imagine the anguish of not knowing how your son or your brother is doing, not being able to offer them support or even just get some reassurance. This no contact policy has been criticized a lot for potentially causing psychological harm, not only to the inmates, but to their families as well.
Okay, so we've established that security is like the top priority here. But what about daily life inside? What are the conditions like for the 40,000 inmates living there?
Well, think Spartan.
Yeah.
Minimalist, almost like austere. The inmates are housed in these windowless cells, often overcrowded. Sanitation is basic. The food rations are pretty minimal. And access to things like sunlight or fresh air is severely limited. Even exercise is restricted to just 1 hour per week.
These conditions sound really harsh. Is the goal here just punishment? Or is there any thought given to rehabilitation?
It's a good question. And it goes to the heart of, like, the prison's philosophy, right? Critics will say that these conditions are just inhumane, that they're designed to break people's spirits and inflict suffering. But then supporters will say that this kind of strict regime is necessary to maintain order and prevent future crime.
It seems like a very fine line to walk. So what happens if an inmate breaks the rules? What are the punishments like in this already harsh environment?
So they have these things called isolation cells. They're basically these dark, sensory-deprived spaces. Inmates can be held there for up to 15 days.
15 days in solitary. That sounds like it could do some serious psychological damage.
Yeah.
Are there any efforts to assess or address the mental health of the inmates?
Right, and that's a really important point. The potential for long-term harm from that kind of isolation is very real. But access to mental health services within the prison is a bit of a uh, contentious issue. Critics argue that the system prioritizes security and punishment over, rehabilitation and the well-being of the inmates.
So we've painted a pretty bleak picture here. Extreme isolation, harsh conditions, and limited human contact. But does it work? Has this approach actually led to a decrease in gang activity and violence in El Salvador?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, right? And it's not a simple yes or no answer. There's no denying that El Salvador has seen a dramatic drop in its homicide rate. In fact, it's now one of the safest countries in the Americas.
Really?
Yeah, but whether that's entirely because of this prison and this mano duro policy, well, that's where the debate gets heated.
Okay, so before we jump into that debate, let's bring in some of the human stories. In that documentary you shared, there was a really interesting interview with a former gang leader. They called him Psycho. What struck you about his story?
It was really the contrast. Like, here's this guy with this reputation for being ruthless. But in the interview, he seemed subdued, almost thoughtful. It was like his bravado was gone, and there was this sense of weariness about him. It made me wonder, what happens to a person's psyche when you strip away their identity, their connections, their freedom?
It's almost like the isolation, as extreme as it is, forced him to, reflect, to confront what he'd done. Did he express any remorse?
He didn't apologize outright, but you could sense the regret in his demeanor. It was like he was acknowledging the pain he had caused, and that's what was so fascinating. Even with someone who had committed such terrible acts, there was still that flicker of humanity.
Right. It's a good reminder that these aren't just statistics. These are real people with complex stories and the potential to change, even in an environment like that.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to look beyond just good versus evil, to see the nuances of individual lives caught in this system.
Okay, so we've set the stage, the scale, the stories. But now the big question, how effective is this approach in the long run? Is it a sustainable solution, or are we just delaying the inevitable?
That's the question that hangs over El Salvador, right?
Yeah.
Can you really achieve lasting peace this way? Or are you just suppressing the symptoms, creating this pressure cooker that could erupt at any moment?
Really interesting questions. And we'll dig into those even more after a quick break. We'll be back with part 2 of our deep dive into El Salvador's mega prison. We'll be exploring the human cost of this approach, the stories of those whose lives have been forever changed by it. And we'll ask whether this drastic solution offers a path to lasting peace or just a temporary break from a deeply rooted problem. Okay, so we're back and we're going even deeper into this whole mega prison situation in El Salvador. We've talked about the design, the security, but now I want to talk about the people, right? The human impact. What are the long-term consequences of this kind of approach, both for the inmates, but also for the country as a whole?
Yeah, that's where things get really, really complicated. It's easy to get caught up in the numbers, the homicide rate's going down, gangs are being disrupted. But behind those numbers, there are real people, people whose lives have been completely changed by this. So yeah, we have to ask, what's the price of this peace? And who's paying it?
Right, exactly. And one story that really stood out in the documentary was about this guy, Marvin Ernesto Matano Vasquez. His story is kind of like a window into the whole cycle of gang violence, and the choices that young people in El Salvador face.
Totally. Marvin's story shows us that getting involved in a gang, it's not always a simple choice. I mean, he got pulled into that world when he was just 11 years old. You think about the poverty, the lack of opportunities, the need to belong. And if you don't have a strong support system, it's easy to see how that happens.
11 years old. It's hard to even imagine a kid being exposed to that kind of violence, that level of despair. What was it that specifically led him down that path?
He talked about growing up in a community where gangs were just like everywhere. It was the dominant force. Joining them, it felt like the only way to survive, to have some power, some protection in a world where there wasn't much else.
And he wasn't involved in just like petty crime, right?
Yeah.
The documentary mentioned some pretty disturbing things.
Yeah, and that's the reality of gang life. He talked openly about the violence, about taking a life. It's chilling. These young men, they're both victims and perpetrators, trapped in this cycle that's so hard to break.
So now he's in this mega prison, facing the consequences. What was his attitude like in the interview? Did he seem remorseful?
What really struck me was the regret. It was so profound. He talked about the pain he'd caused, not just to the victims, but to his own family, his community. It was a raw, honest confession of a man who was wrestling with his past.
It's like, even in the hardest of criminals, there's still that possibility for change. Did he have any advice for young people, like how to avoid falling into that trap?
His message was really simple, but powerful. He was basically saying, choose a different path. Don't get seduced by the gangs. Focus on your education. Build a better future. It was like a plea coming from someone who knew the dark side, who had lived it and regretted it.
Right, and that message is so important, especially for kids who feel like they have no other options. It just shows how critical it is to address the root causes of this violence, the
Yes.
poverty, the lack of opportunities.
Exactly. If you want to stop the violence, you can't just focus on punishment. You have to invest in these communities, give young people real opportunities, real alternatives.
So we've talked about individuals like Marvin, but let's zoom out a bit. What about the bigger picture? What's been the impact of this mega prison, this mano dura approach on El Salvador as a whole? Have they actually achieved what they set out to do?
Well, on one level, the results are pretty clear. The homicide rate has gone way down.
Yeah.
El Salvador has gone from being one of the most dangerous countries in the world to having a level of safety that's comparable to, like, many developed nations.
Wow, that's a huge change. But is it sustainable? Can they keep this level of control going forever?
That's the big question,
Yeah.
right? And there are a lot of critics who say this mano dura approach, it's just a Band-Aid, that it's not really addressing the root causes of the violence. They worry about potential abuse, about people's rights being violated, about creating a society that's ruled by fear.
So it's a trade-off. Security versus freedom. Are there other ways to approach this problem? Like, are there alternatives?
A lot of experts are saying, look, you need a multifaceted approach. You need targeted law enforcement, sure, but you also need social programs, poverty reduction, education, job creation. That's how you address the root causes of the violence, not just the symptoms.
Right, that makes sense. But then the critics of that approach will say, hey, you're ignoring the very real threat posed by these gangs, like MS-13.
And that's a valid point. You can't underestimate these groups. They're brutal, they're sophisticated, they've got their hooks in so many aspects of Salvadoran society. So yeah, you need a strategy that combines security measures with these social and economic reforms. It's not easy.
So it's a complex issue, no easy solutions. And it's still unfolding, right? This is a real-time experiment, and we're seeing the consequences play out.
Yeah, and that's what makes this whole thing so fascinating. We're not just talking about a prison. We're talking about how societies deal with crime, the balance between security and freedom, the ethical questions that come up when you try to create lasting peace.
We've covered a lot of ground here. The design of this mega prison, the stories of the people inside, the impact on the whole country. But we've only just scratched the surface.
Right. And in the final part of our deep dive, we're going to be looking at the potential long-term consequences of this whole approach. We'll ask, can this model be replicated somewhere else? And we'll leave you with some questions to ponder, some things to think about as you continue exploring this really fascinating and challenging issue.
All right, so we've gone pretty deep into this mega prison in El Salvador, seen the scale of it, heard the stories of the people inside. But now, like, where do we go from here? What does it all mean?
Right? It's like we've been putting together this puzzle, looking at all the individual pieces. Now we have to step back and look at the whole picture. What does this whole experiment tell us about, like, fighting crime in general, about how we balance security with freedom? And ultimately, what does it tell us about achieving lasting peace?
I mean, El Salvador's homicide rate has dropped dramatically since they started this mano dura thing and built this prison. But can it last? Is this really a sustainable model?
That's the big question, yeah. And a lot of people are skeptical. They say, look, this approach, it's not sustainable in the long run. It requires too much control, too much suppression of people's rights, and they worry about the potential for abuse, wrongful imprisonment, creating a society where everyone's living in fear.
And then there's the question of like what happens to the people who are actually in the system. Can you really rehabilitate someone in an environment that's so isolated, so harsh?
Exactly, and that's a key point. You have to ask, what happens when these people get out? Have they been given the tools, the support they need to reintegrate into society? Or have we just made them harder, more likely to end up back in the system?
It feels like a risky gamble, right? With potentially huge consequences. And it makes you think about the role of government. Like, how far should the state go to create a crime-free society? Where do you draw the line between security and individual freedom?
These are big questions, fundamental questions about how we want to live together. And different societies will answer them in different ways depending on their culture, their history.
Yeah.
But what's so interesting about what El Salvador is doing, it's like they're pushing the boundaries, challenging these conventional ideas about how you deal with crime.
It's almost like a social experiment in real time, testing the limits of state power. But can you really isolate an experiment like this? What about the impact on other countries, on the whole region?
Right, crime doesn't stop at borders.
Yeah.
So maybe El Salvador has made things safer inside their own country, but has it just shifted the problem, pushed it into neighboring countries, or forced these gangs to adapt, to find new ways to operate? You have to think about the bigger picture, the regional dynamics, to really understand the long-term impact.
It's a reminder that these issues are all connected, right? What works in one place might not work somewhere else. And sometimes the unintended consequences are just as important as the intended ones.
Absolutely. So we have to approach this with some humility. There's no easy fix, no magic bullet. What we need is the willingness to experiment, to learn from what works and what doesn't, to have open and honest conversations about how we can create a better world.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's important to say that this is just the beginning of the conversation, right? We've explored this one approach, this one experiment in El Salvador, but we've also raised a ton of questions along the way.
And that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Our goal here wasn't to give you all the answers, but to make you curious, to get you thinking critically about these issues. There's no one right answer here. But by talking about it, by learning from each other, by being open to different perspectives, we can move towards a future where security and freedom, they're not at odds with each other. Where peace isn't just the absence of violence, but the presence of justice and opportunity for everyone.
Thanks for coming along with us on this deep dive. We hope you keep exploring these issues, keep having these conversations, keep searching for solutions that make the world a better place. And until next time, keep diving deep.